You know, every time I try to buy anything in this city, it seems like the costs are just going up. And there's never been a tougher time to try and live in New York, especially for families. And some people think that's being allowed to happen on purpose.
Do you ever think about leaving the city?
Oh, yes.
Mayor Adams says New Yorkers should feel relieved after 2 rounds of punishing budget cuts to all but the most essential city services.
Well, if we had to do the 3rd rounds, it would impact garbage pickup. It would impact libraries.
It comes as Mayor Adams makes budget cuts to vital 3K and pre-K programs that are leaving a lot of families in a bind.
The expenses of childcare have been astronomical.
It's quite expensive. It's almost like paying another mortgage.
She's not wrong. According to a new report, more than 80% of New York City families can't afford childcare.
Family would need to make more than $300,000 a year on average.
The mayor has taken aggressive action, but he needs to go further if he's going to stabilize the city's finances.
Councilmember Robert Holden says the mayor's cuts to migrant funding don't go far enough.
When does it end? I'd like to ask the mayor, when do we see an ending to this?
So it's no secret, working class residents are fleeing New York City. But what nobody's talking about is that even though costs are going up for everybody, rent, groceries, utilities, they're going up even higher and even faster for families. And in New York, we keep hearing from politicians about how families are so important, but it seems very little is being done to protect those who are trying to raise the next generation of New Yorkers. And that raises some very uncomfortable questions. Why is it that nobody here seems to be taking any action to protect families? And if families and working class individuals are leaving this place, what's gonna happen to it? And will the city become a dystopian nightmare completely controlled by big tech and big finance? Well, to find that out, we've got to look at the real reasons why families are finding it almost impossible to live in the city, and it's not for the reasons you might think. So the price of groceries is skyrocketing in the city. That's a problem for everybody, but it's an extra problem for families, which nobody's really aware of. But to understand why, first look at how much prices have skyrocketed for everybody. Food prices are up 23% over the last 5 years. And if that wasn't bad enough, groceries are 40% more in New York than other places. But on top of that, families with kids spend 41% more on groceries than families without. But even though that may sound excessive, it's not the real reason families are leaving. And you know what else isn't the real reason either? Rents like this for apartments that are 200 square feet. Look at that, $34.50 for a studio. A family that wants to live in the middle of Manhattan is gonna need $7 grand a month for an apartment. Now yes, housing and food are massive issues, but there's actually another problem facing families that makes both of these worse. And if this particular problem didn't exist, it might actually be possible for families to make it in New York, but sadly that's not the case. There's a daycare inside this alley, and you'd think it'd be affordable because we're in an alley. But sadly, over 80% of New York City families cannot afford to use a daycare, which means less than 20% of people have a child in a place like this. And this one singular issue is totally screwing things up for any family that wants to exist in New York. Because if 8 out of 10 families can't afford childcare, it means 8 out of 10 families have one parent that works and one parent who doesn't. How do you afford the rent and the groceries on a system like that? You don't. That's why people are leaving. But how much do you need to make if you want to survive here?
The childcare sector here in the city is in crisis.
Family would need to make more than $300,000 a year on average to afford childcare in New York City.
Whoa, so $300,000 a year to bring your kids to the alleyway school by the trash cans. Not exactly family friendly. And what that essentially means is you've got to be one of New York City's top earners to live here and be middle class, which by default would make you one of the top earners in America. But what's also pretty interesting is that even though childcare costs are pretty much unaffordable, the providers themselves aren't making enough money to stay in business and they're closing. But even though companies going out of business in New York is nothing new, if childcare is already overpriced and the few providers remaining start shutting down, it's going to be nearly impossible to have a dual parent household where both parents are working. And that's because at some point there just won't be any childcare providers left. And thus it's going to be very tough to afford things like the overpriced rent and the overpriced groceries. And what's crazy about that is, according to Street Easy, it costs $16,000 a year for childcare, which is insane. And we're talking about a small kid who stays in a building and doesn't leave and just waits for their parents to come back and get them. But if businesses like this are shutting down and can't make it even with the costs soaring, it means there's something else going on here which is really wrong that nobody wants to talk about. But in order to understand what the real problem here is, realize that most families are under the impression that after they can get their kids through the early stages, they'll be able to put them in school where the taxpayer-funded daycare kicks in. But for some reason, the city is closing down its pre-K and young kid programs as well.
Almost 10 years ago, New York City made universal pre-K a reality. Next in line, 3K. But the 3K program has had some major cuts. The Adams administration has slashed the city's preschool budget by about $170 million in recent months.
So, as of 2022, there are over 6% fewer kids under the age of 18 living in New York City. And if there are fewer kids living in New York, the city will pay for fewer kid-related programs. And look at this disastrous chain of events. First, you've got families leaving, which means there's no kids in the daycare programs. And if there's no kids in the daycares, those kids don't make it to preschool. And if they don't make it to preschool, they don't make it to high school. And if all the systems that support families end up closing because there isn't any business, it's just gonna get harder and harder for the families who try to stay, and then they'll have to leave. And even finding a low-cost private school here in the city is gonna run $500, $600, $700 a month. And that's on top of the rent for your apartment and the prices of everything you're buying at the grocery store. On top of that, even families who don't have young kids, they've got problems with the public school system in this city. Which is why even before 2020, 20% of New York City kids went to a private school instead of a public school. And now education in New York has changed drastically. If you thought your kids' futures were at risk because of the school system that they were in, you would leave, and people are. So if public schools are a mess and private schools are the only option because either the nearest pre-K is closed or it's over full, you've got to do something to help you afford that extra cost, which is on top of everything else that you pay for. And the way that most families used to do that was to move further away. But you're not gonna move from one apartment to another in an expensive area of town. No, you're gonna go east and you're gonna find a place in Brooklyn or in Queens. But the reason that doesn't work anymore is because public transit in New York is a losing battle. Every year it gets worse, even though some of the stations are now fancy. The trains that run underneath them are an unsafe disaster, totally unsuited for family life. This is a brand new subway terminal and they can't even afford to keep the bathrooms open. Look at that, roped off, shut down. And that's because the subway is just an absolute money pit for the city. And it loses almost $700 million a year to fare evasion alone. And since the transit system here is such a nightmare, families who decide to move east have only one option. But sadly, the city's in the process of taking that away as well. So for many, many years, families who were displaced from the center of New York City for economic reasons could always find refuge in an outer borough if they were willing to get a car. Yes, the rent would be cheaper, the car's a little more, but overall, people were still saving money and they were still able to get places from a transit desert, which is what everything that's not Manhattan is. But now, the city has a new plan called congestion pricing, which is gonna see toll readers popping up all over the city. Gray ones, black ones. Cars in popular parts of town are gonna start being hit with a tax. Now, at first, it's just gonna be in areas like this. Busy, high traffic areas of the city, like downtown, are gonna see a toll of $15 a day per car. But this is a huge problem because let's say you were to move to the Bronx or to Brooklyn to try and save money. Well, traffic in those parts of town is actually gonna get worse. And after traffic gets worse in a certain part of town, what do you think the cure for that is gonna be? It's probably gonna be more congestion pricing. Give it a few years, watch. The congestion pricing is gonna cure the traffic problems in lower Manhattan. And then when that traffic gets pushed to the outer boroughs, they're gonna cure it there as well with the same disease. On top of that, all this increased traffic in outer boroughs contributes to air pollution. And although New Yorkers living living in some of the richest parts of the city are going to have things a little bit better. That same promise is not on the table for residents trying to save money. On top of that, New York is one of the worst places to try and own a car. I mean, look at this. You've got construction in half the road, bike lanes almost nobody uses. That could change, however, after the congestion pricing kicks in. But you've got constant traffic. Parking is very hard to find. This red sign right here means every car on this side of the street could potentially get a parking ticket. And on top of that, the other expenses associated with having a car in New York are insane. Insurance is through the roof. Repairs all across the country are going up. It's even worse here because everything's more expensive here. And not only are the city's public transit fortunes not reversing anytime soon, crime underground, it's actually up 20%. Look at that. Assaults way up. Now, the city's been very big on promising public transit improvements once congestion pricing ends up happening. But the problem is those improvements are going to take a long time. The subway's old and dirty, and it's going to take years to put in elevators and renovate things. And they've got to get the crime problem under control before any of that stuff can happen. And New York has a shortage of police. So it's doubtful how quickly New Yorkers will benefit from all of these promised improvements. But what's not doubtful is that everybody's going to be paying these congestion taxes on day one, even with no results to show for it. But the question that none of New York City's leaders really want to answer is, why are things so much tougher here, seemingly deliberately so as far as families are concerned? And it might be because the unfortunate answer to that is beyond their control. So this charming looking building behind me, this is the Federal Reserve Bank, and what goes on in here controls all of our lives. Right now we are in a recession because the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates to fight inflation, but that's got negative effects on the economy, and it's putting families in a tough spot who are already struggling. And that's because America runs on borrowed money, and the harder it is to borrow money, the harder it is for this economy to do what it used to do. It's now harder to get a loan and open up a business and a storefront nobody wants to touch. It's harder for companies to do things like speculative hiring. That's why we're seeing a lot of layoffs, because in the past, when the interest rates were low, more people had jobs because companies had no problem taking a chance on a few new hires. Apparently, and this is a big problem for families, recent job growth in the city has been among low-income earning jobs. And that's a fancy way of saying that the companies who pay a lot of money aren't doing as much hiring, and the companies that don't pay much, or even the gig economy, are where all the action is. But those aren't the opportunities families are going to be able to survive on. And it's why 1 in 3 New Yorkers are now spending half their income just on housing. On top of that, there's a well-known budgeting rule called the 30% rule, which basically says that families who spend more than 30% of their income on rent have trouble with basic expenses other than rent. Groceries, auto repairs, medical expenses. Now, when things get tough, what do most people do? Well, you cut back on expenses, you cancel things like Disney Plus, you cancel Hulu Plus. But families, it's tougher for them to cut back because there are so many more costs that a family has, and some of these are non-negotiable, like groceries, for example. And people may try to go out and find a new job, but the problem there is that over the next 10 years, the city is predicting about 600,000 jobs being created, but it predicts only 200,000 of them will need a 4-year college degree, which means although things are tough in New York right now, they're only going to get tougher, and the job prospects are just going to get worse as time goes on. And what's making all this worse is the way the city has decided it's going to deal with this. So the predictable ramifications of people who work leaving New York, who needs workers to earn a living and support the economy, is that the city now has less money. Yes, this is being exacerbated by the asylum crisis, but if the city's broke and it stops spending money, things here are going to get worse. Shortages of police have led to surging crime. Shortages of firefighters means an overworked department now has less resources to stop the e-bike batteries that keep exploding. And although the mayor was able to recently avoid further cuts, observers say that won't last forever.
But Andrew Rain of the Citizens Budget Commission said lifting the cuts is ill-advised.
The mayor has taken aggressive action, but he needs to go further if he's going to stabilize the city's finances.
So according to outside observers, the city's budget for the next year is going to run a deficit, a loss. loss of $3.6 billion, which means the city is losing more money every year than any of us will ever see in our lifetimes. And over the next 4 years, the deficit is predicted to be $31.4 billion. And that's in spite of the city being required to operate on a balanced budget. But the real issue here is that as the city runs out of money, there's only one way to get it back, but they can't shut down like all of these businesses that are leaving, which are also part of the problem. No, in this situation, the city's only options are to raise taxes or cut spending, or both. Raising taxes will be an obvious hit to families who are already struggling, but cutting services is also a huge problem, especially as the streets become less safe, and libraries shut down, and the parks get dirtier, and trash just piles up around us. All of these are things that are going to make families question why they're trying to remain here, especially when they're looking for a child care and one doesn't exist. And think about this, as crime goes up in the city, who's going to have the energy to put their life at risk? A middle-aged couple that's got kids? Let's face it, the only people moving here are going to be those that have a real sense of adventure, let's just put it that way. And those are probably people who recently graduated and used to live in a frat house. Those are also going to be people who move here specifically because the degree they acquired allows them to get one of those few jobs that's growing and still requires one. Maybe something in tech, maybe something in finance. But if that's the way that New York City is headed, it's just going to become a transient city where people live here for a few years and then disappear. And this has many people asking, why do we keep hearing about how important families are, while at the same time seeing very little action to help them? It's almost like the city's perfectly okay with losing its current tax base and its future tax base because families are gone. And maybe that means somebody somewhere decided New York's viable path forward involves a transient type economy. Is that really the path New York City should be taking? And why is it that politicians seem so reluctant to offer families a lifeline? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.